أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. Today's the second session devoted to the reign of quantity and the signs of the times by René Guénon. Just to quickly recapitulate, last time, in our very first lecture yesterday, we went over the editorial note and the introduction, and that took a considerable amount of time. And Guénon does have a way of inserting a lot of parentheticals and little digressions, but I am of the view that they're always useful. Nevertheless, it is also possible to sometimes lose sight of what's going on in the midst of all of the verbiage. So I think it would be instructive if we just quickly try and recapitulate what we have gone over and then plunge into the topic at hand in chapter 1. Chapter 1 is where he really begins to discuss quality and quantity, and before that he sets out his justification for this book by saying that he wanted to further elaborate upon what he had originally introduced in his book, The Crisis of the Modern World. And this is the reign of quantity and the signs of the time. So the modern world is in crisis. It's in crisis because of the peculiar cyclical conditions in which we find ourselves, because we are in the Kali Yuga. And the Kali Yuga is characterized by a particularly pronounced fixation, if we may put it, on quantity. And it is under this reign of quantity that we find ourselves. He indicates also that people really need to be disabused of this fascination with modern views, especially modern science. And so this book is also seen to be a kind of, how did he put it? He wants to provide a further and more complete demonstration of what, in a very general sense, is the true nature of the traditional sciences. But of course, his main concern really is to look at this quantitative fixation, which is the characteristic of the modern mentality, and indeed that is the central theme of the study. Now, early on in the editorial note, the editor speaks of Guénon understanding all of human history in terms of its cyclical decline from the Golden Age to the Silver Age to the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, using the Greek formulation. So it's a descent, and that descent from the Golden to the Iron Age is also a descent from form, and the editor capitalizes it here, capital F, or quality, toward matter, capital M, or quantity. So when we actually get into the discussion in chapter 1, he actually finally begins to explain what he means by quality and quantity in chapter 1. But in fact, he only really goes into some detail about quality and leaves the more detailed discussion of quantity for chapter 2. So there are a number of terms which come into play here, and I think it is instructive that we just explain, or at least not necessarily explain, he will do, Guénon does that, but we need to enumerate them at the very least. So, as I said, the editor speaks of form and matter, and he identifies form with quality, and the editor identifies matter with quantity. But Guénon is actually using a different set of words, which he first introduces on page 9 and speaks of essence and substance. So essence is also identified with form and quality. So we get a whole list. We have form, essence, quality. And he's using those, at least in the beginning, to mean the same thing. And those are all, according to him, the Greek eidos, right? And then with matter, which is identified with quantity, we have matter, the Latin materia, the Greek hule, and that he's also calling substance, but that substance should not be confused with the ousia of Aristotle. And quality then, or quantity and quality both, are also part of the categories of Aristotle. Also known as the predicaments, or what are they in Greek? Categorimata. Categorai, sorry. So quality and quantity are also there. And so in that sense, quantity is not poson and quality is not poion. So this is a whole sea of words that you have to keep straight in your head. And he's also speaking in reference to scholastic ideas, in particular the most probably prominent or influential in later times scholastic, namely Thomas Aquinas. So from the very beginning of chapter 1, he also introduces another correspondence. So if we have form, essence, quality, they're all supposed to be synonymous. And those he's identifying with Idos in Greek. But then he introduces a Sanskrit term, Purush. And then that is contrasted with, under the column matter, substance, quantity, Prakriti. Now these are terms taken from Indian philosophy, from Hindu doctrines. And so if you're really interested in what Ganon had to say, then his book, Introduction to the Study of Hindu Doctrines, you can refer to that. Those two terms, the Purush and Prakriti, are taken from a philosophical system, Indian philosophical system, where they're most prominent. I mean, these terms they're quite widely used, but it's taken from a system of Indian philosophy called Sankhya. And Sankhya is also very closely associated with the school of yoga. In fact, they are complementary. They sort of go together. But that's another topic. But Purusha also is representing the masculine principle, and Prakriti is representing the female principle. So there's also a kind of notion of yin and yang, active and passive, and so forth. So that's all there in the very beginning. So that's a lot to take in. So he begins by saying, in the very opening sentence of chapter 1, quality and quantity are fairly generally regarded as complementary terms, although the profound reason for their complementarism is often far from being understood. This reason lying in the polar correspondence referred to toward the end of the introduction to this book. When he says toward the end of the introduction to this book, he means the last part of the last paragraph, which stretches over pages 8 and 9. But especially the very end, which begins, in relation to the special conditions of our world or of our state of experience, these limits are an expression of the two universal principles that have elsewhere been referred to as essence and substance. That's what he's referring to. And they are the two poles between which all manifestation is produced. Poles, right? So here he talks about the polar correspondence referred to toward the end of the introduction to this book. So Genon is a person you have to read carefully. You can't go quickly. This is not a tweet. You've got to really, really focus. So for him, quality and quantity are fundamental. In fact, quality and quantity are the most primary and essential of cosmic dualities. He says here this, quality and quantity, the first of all cosmic dualities, is a starting point, for it is situated at the very principle of existence or of universal manifestation, and without it, no manifestation would be possible in any mode whatsoever. It is the duality of Purush and Prakriti, according to the Hindu doctrine, or to use another terminology, that of essence and substance. Very important. So he's really actually quite precise here, but you only recognize that precision if you have really thought about these terms. Yes. And I think that to do that, you really have to read outside. So you could, I cannot actually find that. I wanted to use it for today's lecture, but I don't know where I've shelved it. This is the problem when you have so many books. There, of course, there is the, Wikipedia and all of this, but there is actually a very good dictionary for so-called Eastern religions and philosophies. It's called the Shambhala Encyclopedia. And it's actually very compact, and I wanted to actually look at that definition there. You could refer to a Sanskrit English dictionary. You could look up the Sankhya system. There's actually a very good history of Indian philosophy by Surendranath Das Gupta, but it started out, I think, in the 30s, so he was influenced by certain Western ideas, which I don't think Genon would like. But again, if you just want to understand about what Genon had to say, Introduction to the Study of the Hindu Doctrines is a very readable and accessible book. His other books on this are not, like his Man and His Becoming According to the Vedanta. But anyhow, for now, you just have to understand that he is associating Purush with Idos and Prakriti with Hule. Now, the problem is when you look at essence and substance, these are very confusing terms as well. And I think that before we proceed any further, we must focus on these so that we understand what is going on. Because if someone comes to this book, having studied Aristotle, for example, they're going to be very confused. And so it's not exactly clear what he means by essence and substance. And if you read that, you think, oh, all right, well, so the problem is that in scholastic philosophy, you have, so we need some background in Aristotle. All right, so Aristotle, when he sets out his logic, and logic, of course, is the study of the three fundamental acts of the mind: simple apprehension, judgment, and argument. And in simple apprehension, we have to study terms. And terms are expressed in the form of words. And propositions are, of course, declarative sentences. So in the basic proposition, in which you have a logical subject and predicate, S is P, or S is a P, Aristotle looks at the different ways that one can predicate something of a subject. And so he speaks of what are known as the five predicables. The five predicables. And let's see, we had a logic book here that we could refer to. So you need to look at a traditional logic book. You can't pick up some modern logic textbook, of which probably the most widely used is by some guy named Copy or Copy, C-O-P-I. Not going to work. So you have to go to a traditional book of logic. So, for example, this is The Science of Logic, an Inquiry into the Principles of Accurate Thought and Scientific Method by Peter Coffey. This is, without any doubt, a Thomist book. So what are the predicables? Aristotle's, etc., etc. So the predicables look at what are all the possible kinds of predication or ways of predicating one concept or term about another. These relations are called predicabilia. And in Greek, that is kategoremata. From the Latin, predicabilia, from the Latin predicare. And in Greek, that should be kategorein, to predicate or assert. The predicables, therefore, may be defined as a classification of the relations of predicate to subject in a logical judgment or proposition. They are called by the scholastics, how do you pronounce this in Latin? Quinque mode predicandi?
Yeah, quinque mode predicandi.
I guess.
Yeah.
The five ways of predicating. And also the quinque voces or voces, or probably in ecclesiastical, do what? Voces.
Voces, yes.
The five words. In Arabic texts on so-called Islamic logic, by which I just mean logic written by the Muslims in Arabic, they're called al-kulliyat al-khams. And if you look at that listing, so there, it's very simple. You've got species, genus, specific difference or differentia, the proprium, and the accident, or what is actually called the common accident. In Arabic, they are an-naw' wal-jins, wal-fasl, wal-khassa, wal-arad al-am. Okay. Now, the thing is that in Greek, genus is genos, differentia is, it's actually smudged here, so I can't read what it is. It's something diaphora. Does that sound right? I think that's what it is. It looks like a delta. And then the proprium is idion. And the accident or common accident is sumbebekos. Oh, and I missed species. And species is Idos. Yes. So this all gets very confusing. So when Genon uses the term essence, he doesn't mean the Idos, which is the species of the 5 predicables.
Sure.
At the same time, there is something known as the categorii, or the predicamenta. Now, this is important because there you get the notion of substance. And that's different from what Genon is saying. So the predicamenta are different from the predicables. So in the predicables, you're looking at what can be predicated of a subject.
Right.
But in the predicamenta, you are actually looking at the nature of these predicates. Right? And so the first basic distinction that he draws, because there are 10 predicamenta, 10 predicaments, 10 categories, and the first one is substance. There, they also, it's in English it's substance, because in Latin they went with substantia. And what were they translating there? There they were translating ousia, not eidos. Okay, I'm not a scholar of Greek, but I have enough sense to use other secondary sources to figure this out. And if you don't figure that out, you're in trouble here. You have no idea what's going on, especially if you've read, some kind of philosophy of Aristotle or something like this. You're just going to be very confused. And it's a difficult book as it is. So you have to understand that when he says substance here, he doesn't mean the substantia, the ousia. And the confusing thing is that substantia is also sometimes quiditas, the quiddity. So there's plenty of room for getting thoroughly messed up. So that's the first category. Well, then the next category is quantity, then quality, then relation, then action, passion, place, when or time, and then posture, and then habit or habitus. So this is not a class on the categories, but simply to point out that in the categories, you have quantity and you have quality. And in the case of quantity, that's poson, and quality, that's poion. So again, when he talks about quality and quantity here, he doesn't mean any of these. So this we have to clear out immediately. This is extremely important, and that's all I really want to say about Aristotle, but that has to be completely flushed out of your mind. Because the very first time I read this, I was very confused. Because I was coming from, it's the same in Islamic philosophy. Right. We use all these, we just use Arabic words and so forth. It's very, very similar if you study a book on logic and you're thinking in English or Arabic or whatever, and you think, well, hold on. And it gets very confusing. So now, so then you have to understand that substance here is not ousia. Substance here is hule. Hule is matter or prime matter, or let's just say matter for now, and that will be dealt with in chapter 2. Here, after just explaining this, he really wants to dwell on what he's calling essence. Okay, so now there's another problem with essence. In scholastic philosophy, so we now refer to the Dictionary of Scholastic Philosophy by Bernard Wilner, S.J., that's Society of Jesus, means he was a Jesuit. We come to the word essence. And it says here, what a thing is on page 42. The internal principle whereby a thing is what it is and has its specific perfections. All right, well, that sounds like quiddity. And sure enough, after that, what I just read, there's a semicolon and it says quiddity. So in scholastic philosophy, sometimes essence and quiddity are used interchangeably. Okay? But then you also have the very confusing situation that sometimes essence is used interchangeably with substance. Because they talk about substance versus accident. Because in the division of the categories, the first division is substantia or ousia. And then the rest of them, all 9 of them, are collectively known as accidents. Because a substance or an ousia is a thing in which an accident inheres. It is the substrate, as it were. In Arabic, we would say it is the mahal. Anyhow, so they often speak then of essence and accident. So essence is also sometimes identified with substance. And so if you go to the Dictionary of Scholastic Philosophy, and then you have to look up substance, QRS, TU, subjective, substance. Okay, substance. Noun, a being whose essence naturally requires it to exist in itself. So ens per se, ens in se. So there's a slight nuance or difference if you want to use essence and substance together. But that's what we don't want to do here. Because when you first see essence and substance, if you're coming from this kind of background, again, a question mark comes in your head. And if you're not coming from that anyway, I don't know, you might go with, nowadays the modern word substance, it's just, again, it's profane science. It has some sort of a chemical idea that, well, what is the substance? It's sodium or it's thorium or those would be elementary things, right? Or it's ammonium nitrate, or it's sodium chloride, or it's potassium nitrate or potassium chloride or whatever. Those are molecules. But that's what they mean by a substance. And then you also have so-called substance abuse. And there's all of these, a controlled substance. Yani, it's very confusing. So you need to sort of completely purge all of that from your head and look at essence and substance and say that, essence he's identifying with Purusha and substance with Prakriti. And as he says later, essence really is what he means by Idos, what Aristotle... Now, oddly enough, if you look into this, I checked under the doctrine of Aristotle, the teachings of Aristotle on so-called form versus matter. There's an article on it in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is the only online source on philosophy which is really reliable. With Wikipedia, you're really rolling the dice on any topic. But anyhow, and it actually says there that sometimes Aristotle used the term eidos, and sometimes he used the word morphe. Hence the term in English, hylomorphism. Aristotle's doctrine that all contingent entities are a composite of matter and form, of hule and morphe, hence hylomorphism. But Genon has his own understanding of this. And so I would like to coin the term Genonian hylo-ideism, because he's going with eidos rather than with morphe. All right. So these two terms, essence and substance, have to be, he says, must be envisaged as universal principles and as being the two poles of all manifestation. But at another level, or rather at a number of different levels, for there are many levels corresponding to the more or less particularized domains that can be envisaged in the interior of universal manifestation, these two terms can also be used analogically and in a relative sense to designate that which corresponds to the two principles or more directly represents them with reference to a particular more or less limited mode of manifestation. Now, when he says analogically, how do you understand that?
From what I remember in logic, there are universal terms, equivocal terms, and analogical terms.
That's how you need to understand it. So he's speaking of a kind of again, a kind of predication, isn't it?
Yeah.
Where you use a term in an analogical fashion. And so in Arabic, that's mushakkak.
Uh-huh.
It's like the term, what's the typical example they give in logic? Is I think they use the term health.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's really what he means, that these terms are also used analogically. All right. So what really are these terms essence and substance referring to? So on the one hand, it refers to these overarching principles, but then also we have in the microcosmic domain the use of the term. So he says on page 12, understood in this relative sense, and especially with reference to particular beings. Essence and substance are in effect the same as the form and matter of the scholastic philosopher. That's an important sentence. Mm-hmm. But he doesn't want to use form and matter. And I wish that this had been spelled out in the editorial note, and he explains why. So after scholastic philosophers, there's a semicolon that says, but it is better to avoid the use of these latter terms, because doubtless owing to an imperfection of the Latin language in this connection, they only convey rather inaccurately the ideas they ought to express. Then he has in the footnote, these words translate in a rather unsatisfactory way the Greek terms eidos and hule employed in the same sense by Aristotle. These terms will be referred to again later. That should be like highlighted. But it's in a footnote. And it's a very important footnote. If you're not in the habit of reading footnotes, you will be lost. So it is a fundamental doctrine of Aristotle, but it's also a fundamental doctrine of Thomistic philosophy, that everything is a composite of form and matter. And stated in another form, or in an equivalent form, is that everything is a composite of act and potency, or that act and potency are a complete division of being. And that is actually the very first scholastic principle. You can refer to the summary of scholastic principles here again. This is a very useful book. It's a tiny book, but it costs something like $30. Nobody reads these anymore, and I'm sure this is a print on demand, but it's worth it if you're really interested in learning things. So it says the very first principle under act and potency: potency and act constitute a complete and fundamental division of being and of every order of being. Okay, and then it says contrary, see also CF, right, and under Thomistic thesis. So this book is very well cross-referenced, and although I am not a Thomist, I find it very, very useful to read. I mean, I think a lot of what is in just as a side note, the system or the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, it has a lot in common with Islamic philosophy, especially in the Shīʿah world, because of course he was heavily indebted to Aristotle, but he was also heavily indebted to Avicenna, and so there's a lot of things in common and a lot of interesting. And it's also interesting because I read these things in Arabic first, and then when I read things like text by Thomas, or actually Thomas Aquinas himself, it's very interesting to see how, because a lot of times the things are equivalent, but they speak of them differently. Like in Islamic philosophy, we talk about how pure being and, for example, the true and the good and beauty. In Islamic philosophy, we say that they're coextensive. That they're, I suppose in more modern language, we would say they're convertible. But coextensive is the translation of the Arabic, musawaqa. But the scholastics call these the transcendentals. And I found that very interesting kind of, these are equivalent formulations in the end. Because to say being is to say the good, is to say true, is to say beauty, truth, beauty, etc. So, going from there, then, keeping in mind then that, and he doesn't elaborate on this, but he's absolutely right about the problems in the Latin language, and we use the terms derived in English from Latin. I don't really know who to blame that on. Can we blame this on Cicero? Or do we blame it on William of Rohrberg or whoever it was that translated Aristotle into Latin? I don't know who the guilty party is here. But that would be an interesting question for investigation. So he simply says that, however that may be, in other words, however the mistake may have happened, Latin, etc., however that may be, to say that every manifested being is a composite of form and matter. Keep in mind that he really means quality and quantity. Act and potency, all of those come in. Idos and Idos and hule. Amounts to saying that its existence necessarily proceeds simultaneously from both essence and substance. Okay? And consequently, that there is in each being something corresponding both to the one and to the other of these two principles, in such a way that the being is, as it were, a resultant of their union, or to speak more exactly, a resultant of the action exercised by the active principle. And here it becomes very much the Hindu idea, Purusha, essence, on the passive principle, Prakriti, or substance. Now, I've inserted Purush and Prakriti myself. That's not in the text on page 12. But he mentioned it earlier on page 11. He continues, and if consideration is confined to the special case of individual beings, The form and matter that constitute those beings are respectively identical. Now he gives you another Hindu correspondence. Respectively identical with the Hindu tradition what the Hindu tradition designates as nam and rup, name and form. But there the form is different than the form here. So I think, now you guys really did Greek properly. I hope. Right? So tell me, I mean, my understanding...
Tried my best.
Well, my understanding is that morphe really has more the sense of shape. Like the shape of a circle or the shape of, I don't know, a cone in geometry or the shape of a shoe, for example. Yeah. Right? Whereas Eidon has more the sense of what? Any idea?
I only know it from Plato, which refers to the realm of the forms most of the time.
I think that, I mean, we could look in Little and Scott. You want to look? Yeah. I think that Idos originally meant visible form.
As in the physical world?
Yeah, and morphe has more the sense of shape. And then there's also the Greek term, which isn't used here, but phenomena, which is more like an appearance, right?
Yes. Yeah. Much more of what can be perceived. What is perceived visually.
So, is it the actual thing perceived, or is it the percept?
It's what's perceived.
Yeah, it's what's perceived. The image in the mind, or what is actually perceived. Yeah. So it's the thing perceived.
Yes.
So let's see what is in there under Idos. So the reason this is important, while he's looking that up, the reason it's important to dwell on this, I think, is because Guénon is making the claim that when Aristotle uses the term eidos for so-called form, excuse me, it's actually the same thing as Plato, when Plato uses in his theory of forms or theory of ideas. And so that's at another level. So when we're looking at these things, we can talk about their quality and quantity, but on the highest level, it's the reflection of the Platonic idea as well, right?
Yeah.
So what does it say there?
And another interesting thing, I think Plato also used eidos to refer to the unit, to the one as well.
Did he?
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
That's something I learned. Eidos, that which is seen, form, shape.
That which is seen, so visible form.
And there's endless more.
I'm sure it goes on and on. I mean, it's Little and Scott. It has to. It probably gives every reference from...
Oh, I mean, it gives references from Homer.
It has to give references from Homer.
Yeah.
What does it say? How does Homer use it?
The one I just read was... It says frequently in Homer.
Yeah.
That which is seen, form,
that
or
which
shape.
is visible form, yeah.
And then also in Homer it says of the human form or figure.
Okay, check morphe. Let's just do this right. Check morphe. Keep mark that with like this thing here in case we want. Yeah, just.
I got this.
I don't have a post-it note right now. Just use that. Anyway, so once we find that, so now he's introducing this notion of nam and rup. Now, if I'm not mistaken, those terms they may well be from the Vedanta system of Vedanta. But, like many other terms, it's probably used in other systems as well. But I'm not an expert, so I don't want to say, but that's my guess. And then he will further on come directly tie this in with the Aristotelian idea of active and passive, or actuality.
Morphe with a eta at the end?
Yeah.
Morphe has eta. It's not... No, it's morphe... Yeah, morphe has eta at the end, not epsilon.
There it is.
Yeah.
Morphe. Form, shape. Twice in Homer, not in Hesiod. What else?
So it is shape. So the distinction between the two as visible form and shape, that's an important nuance. But obviously they can be used probably, who knows, we're not ancient Greeks, but apparently Aristotle used them both.
I think in the Odyssey,
Uh-huh.
Alos men Idos akinoteros, blah blah blah. God adds a crown of shapeliness to his
You
words.
see. All right, so
This was book 11.
so we haven't completely misunderstood anything. We seem to be on pretty okay ground. If I could have that a little bit. Yeah, that's good. So, well, let's just go back there. So essence is the passive principle. Essence is active. Substance is passive. And then, again, essence is also nam or name. And then substance is going to be rup or... rup actually means form here, so it gets confusing, but he wants to make these correspondences. So then he makes a further correspondence. He says, it may be added that the Aristotelian designations act and potency also correspond to essence and substance. Aristotle terms are susceptible of a more extended application than are the terms form and matter. Here he means the terms act and potency. But to say that there is in every being a mixture of act and potency comes back to the same thing in the end. For act is that in him by which he participates in essence, and potency is that in him by which he participates in substance. Pure act and pure potency could not exist anywhere in manifestation, since they are true equivalents of universal essence and substance. So pure potency would be complete and total. It would be pure hule or pure materia prima, prime matter, which doesn't exist anywhere as a mental abstraction, right? And he says in manifestation because pure act is God.
Yes.
So he doesn't use theological language very much, if at all, but certainly not so far. He always uses some kind of a metaphysical language. And so he doesn't speak of creation. He speaks of manifestation. So you have the undifferentiated, unmanifested, utterly non-delimited divine essence, which is beyond even the delimitation of non-delimitation. That's the way the Muslims would talk about it. Muslim philosophers would talk about it. And then there is a manifestation. Plotinus uses the idea of emanation.
Yes.
And the Muslim philosophers, when they use this, they talk about fayd, which also just means emanation, or it means to overflow. But people like Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi, or people like Suhrawardi, they use the imagery of light. And Ibn al-Arabi, that's Suhrawardi. And Ibn al-Arabi uses the idea, the notion of the theophany of the divine names. That, the divine essence is utterly unknowable and utterly undifferentiated, yet in its utter simplicity and in its integrality, there are certain, if you will, internal articulations and presagings, as it were, of the multiplicity of the divine names, which themselves are merely delimitations of the divine essence. And so there's a kind of notion of manifestation as well. So whether it's manifestation or creation, let us not quibble over terms. It's simply a trying to get across the notion of the relationship, the connection between, if you like, God and the world, where the world is other than God, the cosmos, or between, what is the relationship between the divine and the universe. That's all that he's trying to say. So there's this notion of manifestation. And so at that highest pole of manifestation, obviously you're going to have pure act. And at the lowest level, you would have what asymptotically approaches pure potency, but never gets there because pure potency is not possible. So everything in between is a mixture of potency and act, and therefore is a mixture of what he calls essence and substance. So even though we're in the reign of quantity, manifestation, we cannot get away from quantity. Otherwise, nothing would exist. Things have a quantitative dimension, but it's this reign of quantity that he's against, right? Because if you understand this, with the passage of time, we are temporally further and further removed from the principle with a capital P. And so when that happens, then multiplicity and all that entails increases. And as we move further and further away, so to speak, from the 0 point, the initial point, if you like, then chaos and all the multiplicity and all of this has to multiply. And that's why we're at the Kali Yuga. The Kali Yuga is the end point. So, just the background, you have to understand how he's talking. Okay. So this brings us almost to the end of the chapter. Let's just continue on this on page 13. It says, provided that this is clearly understood. In other words, how the universe is, everything in the universe, every contingent thing is a composite of potency and act, of quality and quantity, of essence and substance. And as I just elaborated, provided that this, what we just talked about, is clearly understood, it is possible to speak of the essence, capital E, and of the substance, capital S, of our world. That is of the world, that is the domain of the individual human being, and it can be said that in conformity with the particular conditions that define this world as such, these two principles appear in it under the aspects of quality and quantity, respectively.
And that's that he's referring to
the
essence.
point. That's the point, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Now, this is very important. He says, this may appear evident at first sight so far as quality is concerned. So with quality, it's a lot more obvious. Since essence is the principial. When you read Genon, you always have to look at the P words carefully, because sometimes he says principle, but other times it's principial. So you have to look very closely. Since essence is the principial synthesis of all the attributes that belong to a being and make that being what it is, that's why it's also the quiddity.
Sure.
That explains why they use the word essence to mean quiddity sometimes in scholastic philosophy. And since attributes and qualities are really synonymous, and it may be observed that quality considered as the content of essence, capital E, if such an expression be allowable, is not exclusively confined to our world, but is susceptible of a transposition that universalizes its significance. Then he says, there's nothing surprising here. There's nothing remarkable in this, because essence represents the superior principle. And he goes on, but in any such universalization, quality ceases to be the correlative of quantity. For quantity, unlike quality, is strictly linked up with the special conditions of our world. That's very important. So they're not really correlatives when we talk about the domain in which we live. Then he says that from a theological point of view, furthermore, from a theological point of view, is not quality in some way brought into relation with God himself when his attributes are spoken of, whereas it would be manifestly inconceivable to pretend to assign to him any sort of corresponding quantitative determination. So again, he's saying it's not correlative. They're not correlative. And then again, he emphasizes at the end here, the very bottom, 2 lines from the bottom of the page, last paragraph, it says, it is of interest to note, on the other hand, that the form of the scholastics is what Aristotle calls eidos. And that's already alluded to in the footnote on page 12, because he says these terms will be referred to again later. So here they are. Eidos. And this latter word, eidos, is also used to mean species, which I told you at the beginning of the lecture.
Yes.
Okay. So I went and checked up all of this, and it's easier said than done. You can't just go and Google these things. You've got to spend some time in the library or with real books. So eidos also is used to mean species by Aristotle, which is properly speaking a nature or an essence common to an indefinite multitude of individuals. So he's there referring to the use of eidos as species under what? Under the predicables, not the predicamenta. Yeah, you got to keep those clear in your mind. So the 5 universals, and what we call in Arabic the al-kulliyat al-khamsa, and what the scholastics call the 5 voices. Okay. Specific nature is of a purely qualitative order, for it is truly innumerable in the strict sense of the word. That is to say, it is independent of quantity, being indivisible and entire in every individual belonging to the species. So he's explaining here how this term Idos is used as a predicable under the 5 predicables, as species. That is also an important insight. I mean, if you go back and study in logic, it all has to do with what is called in logic intension and extension. But that's intension, not tion, and extension, sion again. So, species being indivisible, right, and entire in every individual belonging to the species, so that it is quite unaffected by the number of those individuals, plus or minus not being applicable to it. Then he brings home the other important association. So he's just explained how the term Idos is also used to mean species, and now he says that Idos is also etymologically the idea that we find in Plato. So again, idea not in the modern psychological sense, but in the ontological sense at which Plato uses it. And he elaborates on this, saying that, but also in an ontological sense, nearer than is ordinarily supposed to the sense in which Plato uses it. Now, what he's alluding to here is the unfortunately very widespread conception among classicists and scholars of ancient Greek philosophy that Aristotle was like the bad boy of the academy, and he went against Plato, and they really differed with one another. And the modern people are always looking for some sort of historicization of everything they read. They're not really concerned to very much, and Geron would agree with this, in terms of, well, what is important here? What can I learn from this? It's about some strange historical thing which they have to find, and of course then they have to write a paper about this. And it wasn't so bad in the early days of 100, 200 years ago. It's much, much worse now because they just write stuff to get tenure. They just write whatever. And this goes back to there was a German classicist, I think his name was Jaeger. And he wrote, is it Jaeger? Yeah, he has the critical edition of Aristotle, some of Aristotle's works as well. So that somehow Aristotle is attacking and rejecting the notion of the ideas. And so what I'm espousing is, if I say that this is a myth, this is a kind of a heresy. Because there's supposed to be a clean break. But the odd thing is that the ancients didn't think this way. And what is called Platonism, not Neoplatonism, that's also something invented by classicists. They all saw themselves as followers of Plato. They read Aristotle as well, and they all believed that there was a harmonization. And there's actually a book by what's his name?
Boethius?
No, he's a modern scholar, Lloyd Garrison. And Lloyd Garrison also did some interesting translations of Aristotle with that guy Hippocrates Apostle.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So Lloyd Garrison wrote a whole book, which I think he calls Aristotle and Other Platonists or something like this, in which he argues that for harmony, and that the notion of harmonization of Aristotle and Plato was what the ancients upheld, and Al-Farabi also upheld that. So followers of Leo Strauss, take note.
Yeah, I didn't know that there were many people who believed in just a total harmonization of the two, but from my readings of it, it just seems like Aristotle really elaborated on what Plato was espousing.
And so that's what he says. For whatever may be the real differences in this connection between the conceptions of Plato and of Aristotle, as so often happens, they have been greatly exaggerated by disciples and commentators. The Platonic ideas are also essences. Plato gives expression chiefly to the transcendent aspect, and Aristotle to the immanent aspect. So Aristotle's system is more accessible to people who are immersed in the dunya, who are immersed in the world of multiplicity and change and so forth, and they want to understand. And Plato is kind of, you have to rise up. It's a kind of ascent, isn't it? Okay, so then he goes on. Now he makes one more filiation. So so that we keep this straight. So he's saying that quality is associated with form, is associated with essence. That's Idos. Idos is also used by Aristotle to mean species. Idos is also used by Plato for his doctrine of the ideas. And then the last filiation is, furthermore, the Platonic ideas under another name and by direct filiation are the same thing as the Pythagorean numbers, and this shows clearly that although the Pythagorean numbers are, as already indicated, that was in the introduction, called numbers analogically. They are in no way numbers in the ordinary quantitative sense of the word. They are, on the contrary, purely qualitative, corresponding inversely on the side of essence to what the quantitative numbers are on the side of substance. So we're almost done with the chapter. Now he introduces a very concise pronouncement of St. Thomas Aquinas in Latin, numeros stat ex parte materiae. Number stands on the side of matter. So he says, on the other hand, when St. Thomas Aquinas says that numeros stat ex parte materiae, in other words, number stands on the side of matter, he is speaking of quantitative number, not the Pythagorean number, which are only numbers analogically speaking, thereby affirming decisively that quantity has an immediate connection with the substantial side of manifestation. In other words, with materia, with matter. The word substantial is used here because materia in the scholastic sense is not by any means the same as matter. So now that is his justification for why he wants to use substance there instead of matter. And he has his his own understanding of matter and materiality and so forth, which comes out in the next chapter. So he's saying that matter is not the same, when the scholastics use materia in any way as matter understood by modern physicists, and he dwells on this at length in the next chapter. So it is only really properly substance, whether that word be taken in its relative meaning as when it is put into correlation with forma and related to particular beings, or whether it be taken when materia prima is in question. So now this is getting ahead of the thing, but he's using this now to segue into the whole discussion of matter in the second chapter, which is materia signata quantitate, or matter marked by quantity. I guess that's the meaning of the Latin.
Or designated as well.
Yeah. So that's what he says, that it's necessary to go into more deeply into the relation between quantity and substance in order to present a clear picture of the various aspects assumed by the Western conception of matter, even before the advent of modern deviation, in which this word was destined to play a great part. And of course, he concludes by saying, it is all the more necessary to do so because this question is in a sense at the very root of the principal subject of this study. Because the central theme of the book is the study of quantity, as he understands it. And so now he has to explain that because he's associating quantity with substance. So that's what's coming out in the second chapter. So we conclude our discussion of chapter 1 here. Wallahu a'lam, and Allah knows best. And thank you for watching. Okay.
Well, so Dr. Ahmad, it would seem that many modern scholars are not entirely enamored of these works here by Wüllner.
Wüllner or any of them, yeah.
What's going on? What's the situation?
I think that scholasticism and Neo-Thomism or Thomism, the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, and mind you, I say this as a non-Catholic, but I think that his thought and all of scholasticism, it's just a discredited. It's considered a relic of the past. It's considered just irrelevant. They're not interested in it. I mean, you really only find it in Catholic institutions of learning, right? Or in direct, what would you call them? Seminaries, right? But I mean, like if you maybe a Catholic university, like like Villanova, is that a Catholic? Maybe you'll find it there.
Sure.
Maybe you find there's places in Canada. There's like what is that place? Louvain in Belgium.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a traditional stronghold.
That's right.
But I don't think you're gonna find anyone interested in this at Brown University or Swarthmore or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's just on a whole other level. It's very deep, and I mean, if you haven't done that background, I don't think you can understand anything that was said in chapter 1.
Yeah, and it's very purposeful by Genon. I mean, he wrote it in a way such that only a select few could decipher any of this.
But I think the reason, and it goes the same for Islamic philosophy. You know, is Islamic philosophy, if it's taught at all, is taught in departments of Near Eastern studies, and there the whole historicist image is there. Again, you know, knowledge is considered like if you find out, well, when did this person live? What was the historical background? You know, what were the power dynamics in that person's time? What were his influences? And that's it. You know, does Avicenna or does Ibn Rushd or does Suhrawardi or Ibn al-Arabi or Mullah Sadra or any number of people have something to say to us now? You know, what the person said, you know, is it true or not? God forbid that we should talk about truth. These things are just looked down upon. Because I think, again, it's the spirit of the modern world. It's the spirit of rebellion. It's the spirit of, you know, don't tell me what to do. I'm going to do whatever I want. It's the spirit
it's arrogance,
it's
narcissism.
It's narcissism. It's the spirit of anything goes. You can just make up a bunch of nonsense. And, you know, there's very little proper and careful analysis and thinking because logic isn't taught anymore. Language has been corrupted. Education has been destroyed. It's been completely dumbed down. You know, unless you really seek it out, where are you going to learn logic? I mean, the only places where they really teach logic anymore are in seminaries, Shiite seminaries, or Catholic seminaries.
Yes.
I don't really know where they do logic properly. I mean, real logic. I mean, all this modern symbolic logic. You know, there's just
logic problems you see at any local
that's a whole
bookstore.
other discussion. But the logic as taught by Aristotle that's actually close to the way people talk and think and which is useful, they don't want people to learn that.
Yeah.
It's the same reason it's the 7 liberal arts. They've got rid of the trivium.
And the quadrivium.
But the trivium is extremely important. Essential. You must have logic, grammar, and rhetoric. That's why people can't communicate today. That's why people cannot speak English properly or whatever language. We're in America, so... that's why also public discourse is just nonsense. So it's all part of the whole Kali Yuga, I would say.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
for sure. So, which works of Aristotle would you recommend for those looking to gain a better grasp on logic itself?
Okay, let's go one by one. If you really, Aristotle, unfortunately, the condition in which his corpus of writings has reached us is such that it is not terribly readable. And so people who are familiar with that will say, well, that's a real understatement. So they're not really accessible. Probably these were his notes, whatever the case may be. So if you're starting from the very beginning, I wouldn't recommend anyone to jump into Aristotle immediately. What I would recommend is a very interesting book. It's a very readable book called what? Aristotle for everybody.
By Mortimer Adler.
By Mortimer J. Adler. It's so accessible. Excellent. And it's...
I've read the whole thing.
You read the whole thing. And you can buy it for like $5 even in hardcover on, it's very... Why? It was published so many times you can easily find a copy.
Right.
Online, used bookstore, wherever.
And in that, he has a little section where he says, I would not recommend you start with Aristotle, but if you really want to... Then he gives an entire list.
At the end of the book,
yes.
That's the thing. At the end of a book, he gives a list of how you should go about reading Aristotle. So that's a really, really good place to start. And the brilliant thing about Adler is he was able to really convey very complicated ideas in simple language. Now, that's the mark of a wise man.
Yes.
And what do you have in modern academic writing? Just a thicket of verbiage that says nothing.
Endless obfuscation.
Oftentimes that's the case.
Yeah.
But it's a very beginning book. But then what I usually tell my students to do is after they read that book, the Adler book, Aristotle for Everybody, I recommend this book is right behind you. It's Aristotle right there. Go to the right. Right there.
The brown one.
This is a really good book. It's called Aristotle, A Guide for the Perplexed by John A. Vella. It's by Continuum Publishers. This is a very good book. And so it's on a more... it's at a higher level.
Yeah, sure.
And he has direct quotations and so forth. But again, he does a masterful job. And he starts with, the concept of knowledge, episteme. Right.
Yeah.
And then he goes to, metaphysics. Or does he go... No, he goes to nature, physis. Nature. And then I think he goes to ousia, substance or, being. How he does it there. Book. And then he goes to... What's the last one? Eudaimonia, success.
Happiness.
Yeah. Happiness, yeah.
There's even that book... I feel like it's much better for younger kids, though. Like Aristotle in 90 Minutes by Paul Strathern. That's also, if you're really short attention span, that's one.
Yeah, you need to work on your attention span. This is another problem today.
Absolutely.
The Twitter generation. No ability to concentrate.
Which is why I don't recommend those 90 Minutes books.
Well, this also must be remedied. This is an ailment which must be fixed. But I think that's the reason, and that's just a pity. So most of modern education is just, it's not really education. It's a kind of indoctrination. It's programming. So
processing.
Alchemical processing.
See Propaganda by Jacques Ellul.
Jacques Ellul, yeah.
But to answer your question, though, I don't think Aristotle does not have just one work that he called logic in the same way. Right. In the same way that he has one towards rhetoric and poetics. But from what I've looked, I think if you want to look at Aristotle, I think it's called categories, prior analytics, posterior analytics.
Okay, so no, but that was his original question.
Yeah, that has, I think, most of his logic. I've sort of skimmed through it.
Yeah, but again, that's not very readable. If you
it's very scattered everywhere.
No, it's very scattered. So if you want a systematic book to read, which is actually perfect for self-study, I did a video on it called The Logic Reading List, right?
Yeah.
So that's the book. It's called Socratic Logic. So maybe that's a bit confusing, but it's by Peter Kreeft because he believes in the idea of the Socratic method and so forth. And it's actually a very nicely done and very readable book, and it has exercises.
Excellent. It's a textbook.
And it has the answers to the odd ones, I think. And if you want the rest of the exercises, you just email the publisher, and they'll send you a Word file. It's St. Augustine Press, South Bend, Indiana. And it's a really good book.
One that I also used was, what's it called? I think it's just called Aristotelian. It might be difficult to find, but Aristotelian Logic by Mary Michael Spangler.
Mary Michael Spangler, she's a nun.
She's a nun. That one's 13 chapters. She writes exceptionally well.
It's published by University Press of America, which is Catholic also.
Yeah, she uses a lot of nature examples.
It's a brilliant book.
I think she might have been a botanist. She was very detailed in her.
Yeah, she did a great job. Yeah. I think we mentioned all of those in the Logic
we must have, yeah.
Yeah, so refer to the Logic Reading List video as well. Yeah, put a link to that. Yeah. Anything else you want to talk about?
No, this whole chapter was just a chapter of definition, which is why
I think so.
Look into logic.
Yes, because you have to define your terms, and although he doesn't give a straight definition anywhere, if you read it the way we did, you will find what you're looking for. I kind of wonder sometimes, did Guénon actually write it this way on purpose, just to scare off the dabblers and the dilettantes and the people who aren't really, willing to put in the
You
time.
mentioned this in your lecture on the Philosopher King in Islamic thought, if you remember. Something about Mir Damad or something he wrote in a very
Mir Damad's the only one who I would say actually did it.
Actually did that?
Yeah, the Straussian thesis that he advances in Persecution and the Art of Writing, that maybe that's what Maimonides was up to. I'm not an expert on Maimonides. I'm actually not too interested in Maimonides. But in Islamic philosophy, it just doesn't hold water. Yeah, because Ibn Rushd wrote very clearly.
Yeah.
Ibn Sina, maybe not as clear as Ibn Rushd, but he's not trying to hide what he's saying. Sure. And these guys were both de facto like viziers and advisors.
Yeah, many of them didn't need to
people, so they didn't have to hide. And, most. So who would have done that? So Mir Damad, I don't know that he's actually trying to hide anything. I think he just likes verbosity and prolixity. And you have to understand that in this, that rhetoric and Islamic rhetoric, people like to show off their knowledge of language. So that's a dimension of his personality. And another person who sometimes writes in a very impenetrable way is Suhrawardi, but not in the Hikmat al-Ishraq, not in his wisdom of illumination, but in his Persian works, which are on what the French Orientalist Henri Corbin called the visionary recitals. Those are meant to be symbolic, allegorical tales. It's just like what you have in Plato, the myth of the cave, or the myth of air, I don't know how it's pronounced.
The myth of the sun.
No, there's lots of these images, you know. So, and if you understand the symbolism, and it's not very hard to figure out if you know, because they will have like he'll incorporate something from the Quran right into what he's writing. So his readers would have been very familiar with the Quran, and then the light bulb will go off and and then it's like this and it's like that, and they make these connections, and you find that in Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi as well. So maybe those are examples, but again, those two guys actually did suffer persecution. Yeah. So Suhrawardi was executed, but it wasn't because of his writing. It was because of, you know, there were people who were jealous of him and so forth. And Ibn al-Arabi, you know, he was who he was, and he did write some things in which he spoke in a certain way, and that was scandalous and so on and so forth. So. But the overall, you know...
Do you think Genon was doing this?
I think Genon... I'm saying I can't help but wonder if Genon is doing this. I can't help but wonder that, you know, maybe the notion of esoteric writing applies here. But Genon is, again, if he's doing that, it's not because he's worried about persecution. Yeah. It's because he doesn't want the profane, you know, people to read his book. He's not interested...
Well, he says in the introduction... it is scarcely necessary to say that everything that the author has set out in this book and elsewhere is intended to be addressed exclusively to these few, the traditional, without any concern for the inevitable incomprehension of the others. Yeah. So no matter what, they're not going to be able to comprehend this whatsoever, whether they like it or not.
But I wonder if he is...
Which is why I think he doesn't care.
Yeah, he doesn't care.
This is just the way he writes.
Yeah. Maybe so. Yeah.
I mean, it would certainly... I think it's certainly a possibility that given his experience with theosophy and the way that they twisted, you know, a lot of these, you could say, Eastern or Oriental doctrines, you know, Buddhism and Hinduism and whatnot, and this sort of ridiculous decontextualization that they engaged in, I think he might have been fearful in a way that his works could have that same potential for people to go in and say, and take things out of context, which is very hard with this, given how just simply how couched everything is in context. It's hard to pick one sentence. I mean, these ideas are expressed in whole paragraphs, many of them very long, it seems.
Yeah. It's interesting you bring up the example of theosophy, because that's just a quagmire of and he wrote a book against theosophy. I don't know if you know that. Yeah, it's listed. It's
up there somewhere.
Yeah, what's it called? Well, we have a list here. What was it called? Theosophy, a history of an error or something.
History of a pseudo-religion.
History of pseudo-religion. Yeah, 1921. Theosophy, a history of a pseudo-religion. Yeah.
There's even a chapter in, this was in our Against the Modern World reading list.
Right.
In Vectors of the Counter-Initiation by Charles Upton. He has a whole chapter dedicated to not just Genon's critique of theosophy, but his own critique.
Yeah, there's a lot of... He names names too. Blavatsky and Solovyov.
That's a long one. Wow.
Yeah, it's a big book. Okay, I think then we can wrap it up here.
Yeah. Move on to the next chapter.
Take a few minutes break if anyone, and then we'll do the next one.